There we go. What up, what up, what up, what up? What's going on, everybody? How's everybody doing today? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank y'all for tuning in to DnL&x Fitness live stream. We got a good one in for you today. Today, again, we are pressed for time, but we're going to get right on time with the time that we got because I got to give you something. I can't leave you hanging. We got to have some kind of stuff to talk about today. But thank y'all for tuning in, man. Today is Wednesday, hump day. Yes, sir. I got to get over that hump today. So make sure that you're, getting it in, focused and, grinding because we got 2 more days to the weekend. Yes, sir. And it's coming around the corner. Hopefully you got your rent paid because rent is due. Rent is for sure due. Yes, sir. So, man, thank y'all for tuning in. I appreciate y'all so much. Today, we have a good little show for you, but we got to kind of skip a couple of segments, but we're going to get right into it and not waste too much time today. But if you must know, we are simultaneously streaming on YouTube, Twitch, Kick, and Rumble. That's right. Yes, sir. We are simultaneously streaming on all 4 platforms at the same time. If you're on YouTube, do me a favor. When you see that little like button right there, hit that like button for me to get the algorithm out on YouTube. And if you're not on YouTube and other platforms, hit the follow button and give me a follow. You are greatly appreciated. If you want to contribute to today's show, bam, there's the Cash App and the Venmo. Cash App is going to be Daniel2888. Venmo is going to be Danny-Daniel-00. Yes, 00. Like 007. I should have put 007 at the end of that thing. But yes, today we are going to get right into the show because, like I said, I'm pressed for time. Hate to be all rushing and going too fast, but we got to do what we got to do. We're going to make it happen. But we're going to get straight into the economy portion of the show like we normally do fitness. But today we're going to hit the economy portion of the show. The economy portion of the show, we're going to sit down and go over the history of central banking and enslavement of mankind, part 4. Yes, part 4. We are going in on it. And part 4 is going to be a century of struggle with the Archilds versus the people. Yes, Archilds. I don't want to say a certain name because I might get, they might come and like knock at my door and I'm going to be like, yes, I may help you. Yeah, so yeah, Archilds. So it's going to be a century of struggle, Archilds versus the people. Yes, sir. It's a nice, pretty lengthy video that we're going to go over, but it's going to give us a lot of insight. We've done part 1, 2, and 3. Now we're on 4, and we're going to see exactly what's been going on. If you don't know about how central banking works, you better learn quickly or as much as you can, because it is the reason why every war, every revolution, every inquisition, even every crusade has went down. You think things are about this on the top, but underneath, when you find out it's about somebody trying to tax you to daylights and make you use their money to earn interest to make you a debt slave, you'll learn a whole lot. With that being said, I'm not going to waste no time. Without further ado, we're just going to get right into it. Let's not waste no time. Let's go ahead and pull this video up on the screen. Bam! Right there, as you can see. We got to change that banner because we ain't there yet. We may make it to the AI portion, but we're going to start with the economy first, and then we'll dip over to the AI portion next, which is going to be basically speaking about white-collar job loss, if you saw the thumbnail. But if you didn't, the AI portion of the show is going to be about AI basically destroying white-collar jobs. But let's get into this video. Sorry to be so fast, but whatever. Let's go. Here we go. Take it away.
A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 4. A Century of Struggle. Rothschild versus the People. Who hold the balance of the world? Who reign o'er Congress, whether royalist or liberal? Who rouse the shirtless patriots of Spain that make old Europe's journals squeak and gibber? Who keep the world both old and new in pain or pleasure? Who make politics run glibber all? The shade of Bonaparte's noble daring, Jew Rothschild and his fellow Christian Baring. Lord Byron, 12th Canto. Central banking in the United States. As this section will show, all previous encounters which the United States has experienced with central banking have been very negative. During the colonial period, the American colonies created their own paper money. The first colony to do so was Massachusetts in 1691. Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and Maryland soon followed suit. They called their currency colonial script, or bills of credit. It freed them from the control of the English banks and enabled them to run their financial affairs in an inflation-free environment with few taxes. Throughout the colonies sustained, stable economic growth and prosperity were achieved, which would not have been possible under a privately run banking system based on usury. In 1763, American statesman Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, visited London, where he was shocked to observe slum conditions and the wide prevalence of poverty. When the British Parliament asked Franklin to explain the source of prosperity of the American colonies, he replied as follows: "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial script. We issue it in proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay anyone." The following year, in 1764, the Bank of England introduced a currency bill which severely restricted the colonies' rights to issue their own money and forbade its legal tender status for the payment of private and public debts.
Dun, dun,
Instead,
dun.
the bank ordered them to issue bonds at interest and sell them to the Bank of England in exchange for English money. In the event, only half of the currency was remitted.
Dang.
As a consequence of this law, the economy of the colonies collapsed, and within 1 year, more than half the population became unemployed and destitute.
Wow.
The Stamp Act of 1765 was the last straw, but the abolition of the colonial currency was the primary cause of the revolution. One of the first tasks...
There it is again. Once again, every time somebody brings their currency into a country or economy or a government that is basically self-governed, every time the private bankers bring in their currency, it's the same outcome. I don't know if y'all can hear that loud lawnmower going on over there. Hopefully you can't, because I can. But every time a new currency, or not a new currency, well, yeah, I guess you could say it. Every time a currency is issued from the bankers, they are using that currency to enslave and indebt the country, and they destroy it via debt slavery by using their currency to charge high interest rates and tax people to daylights. And every time the same outcome happens. The same outcome happens. It's happened every single time. I've done countless videos over this. You can go back and look. The same outcome is what happens. The country goes into turmoil every single time.
Entrusted to the Second Continental Congress, which convened for the first time on the 10th of May, 1775, was to issue its own currency, largely to finance its war expenditures. A total of $241,552,788 was issued during the currency's existence. The Bank of England quickly responded. Hundreds of workmen were recruited, and soon millions of dollars worth of counterfeit banknotes were rolling off the printing presses and being shipped to New York. The continental dollar retained much of its purchasing power during the first 2 years of its issuance, but once the English counterfeit banknotes started to increase in circulation, its value soon fell away, and by 1780, $1 was worth only 2.5 cents. 15 years later, in 1790, the Bank of England mounted another similar operation, when it employed over 400 workmen in 17 factories in southern and central England to print the assignat, which was the currency of revolutionary France. The assignat, which was backed by clerical lands, was in its initial stages successfully circulated as a means of exchange, and a significant portion of the national debt was repaid. However, by 1792, the massive infusion of counterfeit notes soon caused the assignat to plummet in value, and thereafter there was a brief period of hyperinflation. On the 14th of April, 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte introduced the government-issued franc, which acquired the status of legal tender in 1808.
Doesn't what they're doing back then sound similar to what's happening now? These same tactics just get reemployed over and over and over, and the reason why they work is because people don't study this type of stuff. They don't look into it. They don't really care about it. Nobody really cares too much for it, but it's the same situation being employed. It's the same move, same tactic being employed, and then the people that you learned about that are prominent, that are important, we either get a flawed view of who they are or what they were fighting for, or we just get a weird just a different story of what they were doing. But in our reality, they all have the same underlining story of what they were trying to do. They didn't want to be debt slaves and be under someone else's currency, being charged high interest rates on the currency, which would then in turn turn their economy into crap.
Already in 1781, before the conclusion of the War of Independence on the 11th of April 1783, Robert Morris, 1734 to 1806, Superintendent of Finance, introduced a bill which restored the new state to servitude with the establishment of the Bank of North America. This bank commenced operations on the 4th of January, 1782. It attracted large deposits of silver and gold coin and bills of exchange obtained through loans from France and the Netherlands, which enabled it to issue paper currency on the strength of these reserves. Between 1791 and 1796, inflation surged by 72%. In 1795, the state of Pennsylvania withdrew its jurisdiction on account of alarming foreign influence and fictitious credit. On the 25th
Wow.
of February, 1791, the Bank of North America was succeeded by a second central bank, which was chartered as the first bank of the United States. It was imposed as a result of the intrigues of Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, whose actions indicate that he was working hand in glove with the directors of the Bank of England, as it was modeled on that bank. The new bank had a capital of $10 million, of which 20% was held by the U.S. government and the balance by private investors. The bank was
So Alexander Hamilton was basically a trader. He was basically a trader working hand in hand with the private bankers and basically pushing their agenda through. That's what he was doing. So Alexander Hamilton is not a decent human being. He was straight garbage, straight trash. So when you hear Alexander Hamilton, you need to think. Dude was straight garbage. He was horrible. Let's go.
strongly opposed by future presidents John Adams, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, who would later state that the central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. I believe that the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Straight bars, man. And as we're seeing, we're living that existence right now as we speak. Things are going not so good. And it's the same scheme has been played out all the way back when Jesus was roaming the earth. Because remember, if you go back to some videos, you'll see that we were way back in Caesar time. We even went before Caesar, because you had a Copper Age, a Silver Age, and a Golden Age, or era, I should say. Copper era, Silver era, Golden era. But we were all the way back with Caesar, Constantine. We went all the way back in the same tactics being employed all the way through, over and over and over again. So it's crazy. And like he said, somebody who has control over the country's banking is worse than a standing army, because this is crazy. This is crazy.
The following year, the bank organized the first crash, known as the Panic of 1792. By flooding the market with cheap loans and suddenly calling most of them in, the bank precipitated a 25% plunge in the price of 6% treasury bonds, which resulted in financial chaos.
Cheap loans. Isn't that what happened in the 2008 housing market crash, when they were just giving loans to any and everybody? If you worked at McDonald's, you can get approved for a loan for $500,000. $1 million home, you can get approved for a loan. You got cheap loans to everybody. They did this back in 1792. So pay attention. Just pay attention to how they're running this. So we already seen this in our time in 2008, where they gave loans to everybody, and then they called it back in. And when the chickens came to roost, nobody could afford what it is that they were actually getting approved for. And this is what they did right here. This right here, it says they were, by flooding the market with cheap loans and suddenly calling most of them in, the bank precipitated a 25% plunge in the price of 6% treasury bonds, which resulted in a financial chaos, which is what happened. Exactly what happened in 2008. And this is 1792.
By the end of 1795, the bank had lent $6 million to government, or 60% of its capital. As the bank was allegedly concerned about the stability of government finances, it demanded partial repayment of this loan.
So the banks bailed them out. That's exactly what happened. Oh my God. Oh my God. So wait, let me get this right. 1795, so 1819. So like they waited like 200 and something years to run the same game over again. Boy.
The government did not have the funds available and was therefore forced to sell its shareholding in the bank between the years 1796 and 1802. By means of this cunning ruse, the bank became 100% privately owned, of which 75% of the shares were held by foreigners. In 1811, the bank's charter came up for renewal. The bank was concealing its profits, operating in a clandestine manner, and was believed to be unconstitutional. It was designed primarily to serve the business interests of the North at the expense of the agricultural development of the South, while the Democrats, Republicans, Jeffersonians wanted to abolish it. Former President Thomas Jefferson was one of those who violently opposed renewal of the bill.
Now, real quick right here, the banker was concealing its profits, operating in a clandestine manner, and was believed to be unconstitutional. But if you actually do some research and studying, you're understanding that they're not actually being unconstitutional. They're actually operating in a constitutional manner by making you use their currency and then taxing you for it, as opposed to you just stop using their stuff all on your own and not being subject to their currency. So they're not technically unconstitutional. We can dive into that another day. I know a person who can completely school everybody on that, but let's continue.
What particularly irked the legislators was the fact that the bank was now 100% in the ownership of foreigners. The press variously described the central bank bill as a great swindle, a vulture, a viper, and a cobra. Furthermore, they contended that it was the constitutional right of Congress to regulate weights and measures and issue coined money.
So the ownership of the banks is completely foreign, is completely owned by foreigners. Completely owned by foreigners.
Intended that it was the constitutional right of Congress to regulate weights and measures and issue coined money. The bill was defeated by a wafer-thin margin of 65 to 64 votes, which was an achievement, as there is a strong likelihood that many of the yes votes were bought. On the 3rd of March, 1811, the bank finally closed its doors. When the principal shareholder of the First Bank of the United States, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, heard about the deep dissension regarding the renewal of the bank's charter, he flew into a rage and declared that either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. He also said that, I will teach those impudent Americans a lesson and bring them back to colonial status. Rothschild tried to influence the British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval into declaring war on the United States in order to resurrect his privately owned central bank. In 1807, Perceval joined the cabinet as Chancellor of the Exchequer. At that time, England was at war with France, and one of his principal tasks was to raise money in order to finance the war. Instead of increasing taxes, he raised a number of loans, initially from the Barings Bank, and thereafter mainly from the Rothschilds.
Oh, wow.
Percival's secretary was John Charles Harries, who had been appointed to that position 5 years previously. Harries was an intimate of Nathan Rothschild, and until his death in 1858, faithfully served the Rothschild cause in the various positions he held in the British government as First Lord of the Treasury, Commissary General to the Army, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Meanwhile, Rothschild agent provocateurs were stoking up discontent in North America. In order to provoke the Americans, the British started to interfere with the U.S. trade with France, which had imposed a continental blockade against England. As the Royal Navy was short of sailors, they engaged in forced recruitment or impressment of American sailors. They also supplied the Indian tribes, and in particular the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, with arms in order to frustrate and curtail the settlers' westward expansion. The Americans, on their part, indicated a desire to seize parts of Canada. Concurrently, Percival was facing increased pressure from Nathan Rothschild to make a declaration of war on the United States. He refused. The British Army was already bogged down in a stalemate situation in Spain and Portugal, the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814, with Napoleon's forces, and he had no desire to commit more troops and treasure, financed by more interest-bearing bank loans, simply in order to save Rothschild's sinking banking interests in America.
So they start these wars on purpose. When they start these wars, they know that, okay, if I start a war, then I can go and basically feed the private bankers because I'm going to need money for a war. I'm going to need to finance it. I need somebody to help me finance this war. So then me proceeding forward with a war, that's going to cause, you're going to need everything you need for a war, and then it has to get paid back with interest. So you're going to pay it back with interest, and you're going to feed the private bankers. So causing a war, if you're on the private banker side and you're operating with a country, then as the person who is operating under governance of a country, you can decide, well, you know what, I'll just find a reason to go to war, and then I'll just turn around and have the private bankers help us finance this war. And when they do that, we'll just feed them, and they're going to give us a kickback on the back end, basically. So it's like you're operating in treason.
The assassin of Spencer Perceval, John Bellingham, was born about 1769 in St. Neots, Huntingdonshire. From 1800 to 1802, he worked in Archangelsk as an agent for importers and exporters. He returned to Russia in 1804, and in November of that year, he was falsely accused of having reneged on a debt of 4,890 rubles, which subsequently led to his imprisonment for 4 years. On his release, Bellingham took up residence in Duke Street, Liverpool. He unsuccessfully petitioned the government for compensation. Bellingham, a bitter and aggrieved man, fell into company with two dissolute American merchants, Thomas Wilson and Elisha Peck, who were both keen to have orders in council, which forbade neutral nations from trading with France, abrogated. These orders in council had been introduced by Perceval in response to Napoleon's continental blockade, which the latter had instituted in 1806 and prohibited trade with Britain and Ireland. Their continuation was due to be debated in Parliament on that fateful evening. Thus we observe a confluence of interests, a disturbed and resentful man, two greedy merchants, and the puppet master Rothschild pulling the strings in the background.
Man.
At 5:15 p.m. on the 11th of May, 1812, as Perceval entered the lobby of the House of Commons, Bellingham stepped forward and shot him in the heart.
Oh.
Perceval collapsed, uttering, "Murder! Oh my God!" and within minutes was dead. 4 days later, Bellingham was put on trial at the Old Bailey. The trial lasted 3 days. A plea of insanity was rejected. The brevity of the trial was presumably related to the necessity of preventing any untoward disclosures. As is customary with this type of political assassination, the lone assassin theory has to be preserved at all costs. On the 18th of May, 1812, Bellingham was hanged. A few weeks later, after Perceval's murder, the orders in council forbidding neutral nations trading with France were revoked.
Wow.
In the United States House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who was a Freemason, led a group of young Democratic Republicans known as the War Hawks. The vote to declare war was decided on the 1st of June, 1812, by 79 votes to 49, with all 39 Federalists voting to support it. In the Senate, the vote was decided by 19 to 13 votes. As there was no unanimity, critics frequently referred to it as Mr. Madison's War. In England, Perceval's successor, Lord Robert Liverpool, was an enthusiastic supporter of the war. However, neither belligerent was able to achieve its objectives, except Nathan Rothschild, who realized his aim of setting up the Second Bank of the United States on the 10th of April, 1816. When hostilities ceased over 2 years later, on the 24th of August, 1814, over 24,000 lives had been lost. The war was very costly to the United States in financial terms. It incurred a huge war debt of $105 million relative to its population of 8 million. As a result thereof, the national debt increased by 182% from $45 million in 1812 to $127 million in 1815.
Golly.
Peace was signed in Ghent, Belgium, on the 24th of December, 1814. The Second Bank of the United States had an enlarged capital of $35 million. The bank immediately established a large number of branch banks to lend fiat money at compound rates of interest. In 1822, President James
Wow. They put a bunch of little bitty banks around the way so they could be able to lend out more money and charge more interest. So instead of just going to one bank over here in one state, they were like, we'll just put a bunch of banks over here. And they, oh man, boy, oh boy.
Monroe appointed Nicholas Biddle president of the bank. Biddle had first made contact with the Rothschilds while on government business in Paris in 1804, while acting as secretary to United States Minister to France, John Armstrong. As president of the bank, he acted as point man to James de Rothschild, who was the bank's principal investor. The artificially induced recession of 1819 to 1821, which was very profitable for the bankers who were able to buy up assets at depressed prices, convinced the leader of the Democrats, Andrew Jackson, that the only way to terminate these abuses was to close down the central bank. In his re-election campaign in 1832, he declared that the monster must perish, and his chief slogan was, "Vote Andrew Jackson, no bank." He stated that if Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given to them to be used by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations.
True.
He also said that if the American people only understood the rank injustice of our banking and money system, there would be a revolution before morning. Notwithstanding a failed assassination attempt on the 30th of January, 1835, by a presumed Rothschild agent, Richard Lawrence, when the 20-year charter of the Second Bank of the United States came up for renewal in 1836, Jackson collapsed the bank by withdrawing all government deposits.
Okay.
He promptly repaid the national debt in its entirety, leaving a
He promptly repaid the national debt in its entirety? Wow. Okay. Okay. All right. See, so we have another one right here. We have, what's your name? Jackson. Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson stood up for what was right as far as not trying to have his people enslaved through debt slavery. He fought for it. However, I can pretty sure tell you at some point my guy's gonna get skitty popped. I'm telling you. I mean, it's just the same story playing over and over again.
Government deposits. He promptly repaid the national debt in its entirety, leaving a surplus of $50 million in the Treasury. The central bank was replaced by an independent treasury system based on redeemable paper and specie. During President John Tyler's term of office, 1841 to 1845, 2 attempts were made by Congress under the sponsorship of the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States. Clay, who had in 1820 become Grand Master of the Kentucky Lodge, was another agent deemed to be under the influence of the Rothschilds. Tyler vetoed both of these bills and was subsequently inundated with
Well, hold on. Clay became Grand Master, was another agent. So he was an agent. Who is this? Clay? He was an agent. Okay.
hundreds of letters threatening him with assassination. For the next 77 years, the United States developed without the need of a central bank. Its means of exchange were funded primarily by debt and interest-free Treasury greenback dollar bills, first issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862 in order to finance his military expenditure during the Civil War, and gold and silver coins.
There we go.
Up to 1873,
Greenbacks.
gold and silver could be coined at any U.S. mint free of charge.
Up to 1873. So he brought it back. He dismantled, what's his name? Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson dismantled the bank. He had $50 million left over in surplus. He brought in the greenbacks. I think he brought in the greenbacks or whatever. He had a different species of money, whatever that he brought in, but it was backed by gold and silver. So we're good on the go. Everything's good. Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. So, this battle underneath is going back and forth. Now, what we think as far as history goes, when people look at history like this, what do people think around this time frame? Slavery and stuff like that. That's what comes to people's minds. But it always look at the underlying current. That was a it was a way bigger problem going on than that. I mean, it sucks that people had to go through it, but this right here, this was enslaving everyone. This was putting everybody underneath.
After having rejected offers by private bankers to lend money to the United States government at interest rates varying between 24% and 36% per annum, Lincoln had, on the advice of his friend Colonel Dick Taylor, issued $347 million of currency at no cost to the American people except for the expense of printing and distribution. Lincoln's defiance of Lionel Rothschild and his uncle James resulted in his assassination on the night of the 15th of April, 1865, by John Wilkes Booth, real name Botha, at the behest of the Rothschilds' local agent named Rothberg.
There it is. Another attempt. Well, not attempt. Another successful attempt, I should say. Again, it's the same thing. And what's the reason? They were fighting to be able to use their own currency and back it by gold and silver. Private bankers are like, no. That's not finna happen. We finna skitty pop you and get you out of here. And it's the same story. Caesar got shanked up for the same reason.
The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, left the U.S. government with a war debt of $5 billion.
Dang.
As a result of inflation, these bonds had declined in value to $2.5 billion. Large quantities of these bonds were bought up by Rothschild's agent August Belmont in the hope of realizing them at their face value in gold. In the 1868 presidential election, the Democratic Party candidate George H. Pendleton pledged payment only in paper. He was soon replaced by Horatio Seymour on the initiative of Belmont, who had assumed chairmanship of the Democratic National Committee in 1860. Seymour promised payment in specie. However, when the convention passed a resolution in favor of paper,
What is specie? That's throwing me off. What is specie? Let's figure out what that is. What is specie? Specie. Oh, specie is money in the form of coins rather than notes. Okay, so when they say specie, they mean actual coin. Like I would say, like copper, gold, or silver, not paper, not currency. They want money. They actually want money in the form of money as opposed to money in the form of currency is what they're saying. Okay, got it.
Seymour promised payment in specie. However, when the convention passed a resolution in favor of paper, Belmont was forced to switch sides and thereafter secretly supported their Republican candidate, General Ulysses S. Grant, and used his part ownership of the New York World newspaper in order to denigrate and undermine the chances of Seymour. Grant won, and, on assuming office in 1869, he promptly introduced the Public Credit Act, which paid out the face value on the $5 billion worth of bonds in gold. This resulted in the Rothschilds and their associates making a 100% profit.
Wow.
The silver exchange
100% profit. My Lord, 100% profit. So when you hear General Ulysses Grant or whatever, just know that he ain't this. Where is he at? Where you at, buddy? Right here. When you hear this name, General Ulysses S. Grant, and he used his part ownership of the New York newspaper in order to denigrate and undermine the chances of Seymour. Seymour was the one who actually was like, hey, we're going to go back to payment in specie and not in notes. So, yeah, General Ulysses Grant basically used his stuff to undermine Seymour, and then they turned around and they made 100% profit on $5 billion worth of bond and gold.
In the Rothschilds and their associates making a 100% profit. The silver exchange was abolished and replaced by a gold standard by means of an act revising and amending the laws relative to the mints, assay offices, and the coinage of the United States. On the 17th of January, 1873, this act was passed by the Senate. According to a sworn affidavit of Mr. Frederick A. Luckenbach dated the 9th of May, 1892, he had learnt from Mr. Ernst Sade in London that the demonetization of American silver had been expressly ordered by the governors of the Bank of England, who had furthermore paid £100,000, $500,000, in order to have a sufficient number of committee members of the U.S. Congress dealing with financial matters bribed. This nefarious deed became known as the Crime of 1873. The forced abandonment of the people's money, silver, was also instituted in the German Empire when the government inexplicably ceased to mint silver dollar coins in 1871. There seems to be little doubt that this was part of a synchronized scheme coordinated by the Rothschilds in order to further entrench the gold standard. The gold standard wrought havoc on the American economy and enabled private bankers to withhold loans and restrict the money supply at will. There followed a series of unnaturally created panics or bank runs in 1873, 1884, 1890 to 01, 1893 to 94, 1897, 1903, and 1907. These artificially created bank runs so incensed President James Abram Garfield.
They did that many bank runs? They did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, just bank runs after bank runs after bank runs. If you know what a bank run is where the bank just takes your money because they got to basically repay what they owe, but they're just taking your money.
These artificially created bank runs so incensed President James Abram Garfield that shortly after he took office on the 4th of March, 1881, he issued a statement in the middle of June of that year that he intended to master the problem when he said the following: "Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." 2 weeks later, Garfield was gunned down by lone assassin Charles J. Guiteau, who had a grievance for not having received a diplomatic posting.
Again. It's the same thing over and over. It don't stop.
Garfield did not die immediately, but as a result of improper medical care, quite possibly done so deliberately, lingered on until his death on the 19th of September, 1881.
Wait, when did he get...
Garfield did not... Charles J. Guiteau, who had a grievance for...
When did he get shot? Garfield was was popped down on this July 2nd. So July 2nd, he was shot. So from July, August, so 2 months later.
Medical care,
2.5 months
quite
later.
Possibly done so deliberately, lingered on until his death on the 19th of September, 1881. At his trial, the hidden hand of Rothschild was revealed when Guiteau claimed that important men in Europe put him up to the task and had promised to protect him if he were caught. The 1907 panic had the worst.
See, they go ahead and so they send out their lone people and then they just let them get handed over. It's like, all right, we'll get rid of them, which is usually the case whenever there are hits being put on individuals.
Effects. In early 1907, Jacob Schiff, CEO of Kuhn Loeb & Company, worried that unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in history. In October of that year, J.P. Morgan, another Rothschild frontman, set the panic in motion by circulating.
I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that. J.P. Morgan? I didn't know that. What? I should have known. Well, oh my goodness. That's crazy. No way. J.P. Morgan is a front man. Oh my gosh. No way.
October of that year, J.P. Morgan, another Rothschild frontman, set the panic in motion by circulating rumors that its rival, the Knickerbocker Bank and Trust Company, was insolvent. In the ensuing crash, shares listed on the New York Stock Exchange lost 50% of their value. Further consequences of this deliberately induced panic were an 11% drop in industrial production the following year, a 26% rise in imports, and an increase in unemployment from under 3% to 8%. It was these continual phases of artificially created boom and bust, inflation and deflation, which provided the motivation and pretext to set up a central bank, which would allegedly solve all these never-ending problems for all time. Establishment of the United States Federal Reserve Bank. In order to mislead the public, two alternative plans were proposed. One was advanced by the National Monetary Commission under leadership of Senator Nelson Aldrich, grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and known as the Aldrich Plan. The other plan, adopted by the Special Currency Committee of the New York Chamber of Commerce, was under the chairmanship of Paul Warburg, a German Jewish banker, who was acting on behalf of the Rothschild interests headed by Baron Alfred Rothschild. It was known as the Wall Street Plan.
Wow.
Except for the distribution of reserves, both plans were identical and had as their aim the establishment of a central reserve bank. On the 22nd of November, 1910, the banking conspirators included, among others, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davidson, Senior Partner, J.P. Morgan & Company, Charles D. Norton, President, First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, Vice President, Bankers Trust of New York, and Paul Moritz Warburg, partner Kuhn Loeb & Company, sneaked out of New York in Aldrich's Pullman car with all its blinds drawn from Hoboken, New Jersey railway station to Jekyll Island, Georgia. At the very exclusive Jekyll Island Hunt Club, owned by J.P. Morgan, the fate of the American people, and indeed the world, would be determined over the next 10 days by this group of criminally inclined financiers, who were also known as the First Name Club. Only first names were used so as not to reveal their identities to the staff. The bill to establish the United States Federal Reserve Bank was vehemently opposed by Congressman Charles August Lindbergh, who said that,
we have an opposition. We all know what happens to opposition. Yes, sir. Every time there's opposition, what do we end up hearing? Every single time. We get opposition and it's lights out. Every single time. So right here, this gentleman right here, he he vehemently opposed this. And let's see what he says.
This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, such as the Sherman Antitrust.
Did you hear what they said? Hope you understand what that means. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. Understand what trust law is. They put together a trust.
This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act would dissolve if Congress did not by this act expressly create what by that act it prohibited. When the President signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the Pujo Money Trust investigation, will be legalized. The greatest crime of Congress is its currency system. The schemiest legislative crime of all ages is perpetuated by this new banking and currency bill. The bill was bitterly opposed in the Senate, with Senator Robert M. La Follette being one of its most vociferous opponents. It was passed into law on the 23rd of December, 1913, after the members of the Senate had been threatened by the thoroughly disreputable President Woodrow Wilson, who was as devoid of ethics and principle as he was of morality, that he would keep them in session until it had passed the bill and deny them their Christmas recess. Only a minority of 43 senators supported the bill, with 25 voting against it, 27 refusing to vote, and 5 members absent. The promoters of the bill promised that the United States dollar would become a stable currency and that business cycles and recessions would become a thing of the past. In the event since the inception of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank in 1914, the U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power, and there have been 19 recessions. the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the current Great Recession, which started in 2008, and notwithstanding mainstream media propaganda to the contrary, appears to have all the symptoms of a depression.
Whew.
Since 1910, the national...
How many? We've had 19 recessions. 19. One Great Depression, and then we have the current Great Recession. It started in 2008.
To the contrary, appears to have all the symptoms of a depression. Since 1910, the national debt has increased from $2.65 billion to $20 trillion in March 2017, while unfunded liabilities such as Social Security, Medicare, and benefits for military veterans exceed $240 trillion.
Wow! Unfunded liabilities for all exceed 204. What? Oh my goodness! So then who is responsible for all of this? Oh man, I guess we're going to find that out.
Dollars. The United States Federal Reserve Bank, instead of functioning as the people's banker of the bankers, has operated solely as a private bank for the benefit of private bankers. It comes as no surprise that in its 104 years of existence, its accounts have never been submitted to public audit.
Never in 104 years of existence has never been submitted to it. Well, that makes sense because it's a public audit and it's private. So therefore you can't audit someone who gives you the currency to regulate the system in which you're running. Somebody can't, it's like somebody is giving you the currency to play this system, and then you want to turn around and audit the person that's giving you money. Be like, you better shut up. It's like, you better shut up before you get. So therefore, you're not going to audit me. Plus, they're outside of the system. Here's the system. Here's the private banking. So they're giving this to the system. The system's over here. The private bank is over here. So they're not a part of the system, but they do benefit from it majorly. Well, they benefit from the participants of it.
The following are the bank's principal shareholders: Rothschild Banks of London and Berlin, Lazard Brothers Banks of Paris, Israel Moses Seif Banks of Italy, Warburg Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam, Shearson American Express, Goldman Sachs of New York, JP Morgan Chase Bank. The State Bank of the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different system of finance, viz. State banking, had been adopted. From September 1814 to June 1815, the Congress of Vienna was held in order to settle the issues arising from the French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. Behind the scenes, Nathan Mayer Rothschild proposed the
dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, the Napoleonic Wars, and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. This is 1814 to 18. Okay, so they were still going. Okay, gotcha.
And the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. Behind the scenes, Nathan Mayer Rothschild proposed the formation of a new world order concentrated around central banking. All the major powers, with the exception of Russia, were indebted to the Rothschild banks. Tsar Alexander I, 1801 to 1825, refused to comply with Rothschild's devious scheme and derailed it.
Uh-oh, we all know what's about to happen. He's about to get it.
Instead, he established the Holy Alliance between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, which was signed on the 26th of September 1815 by Emperor Francis I of Austria, King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, and Tsar Alexander. He also rejected Rothschild's offer to set up a central bank in Russia.
Okay.
Whether it was because he distrusted the shady banker or was aware of the perils of central banking is not known, but he wisely declined. However, his prudent behavior incurred the vindictive and unrelenting wrath of the Rothschilds, who, according to Major General Count Sheriff Spiridovich, were responsible for the assassination of the last 5 czars and would seek and obtain their Talmudic vengeance in spectacular fashion 102 years later.
Bruh, once again, it happened in same fashion. Oh man, it's the same rotation. It's just going by force. You're being forced into this debt slave currency. They're forcing you into it.
On the 12th,
there has to be a remedy. but they're forcing you into them, but there must be a remedy.
Of June 1860, the State Bank of the Russian Empire was founded with the aim of boosting trade turnovers and the strengthening of the monetary system. Up to 1894, it was an auxiliary institution under the direct control of the Ministry of Finance. In that year, it was transformed into being the banker of the bankers and operated as an instrument of government's policy. It minted and printed the nation's coins and notes, regulated the money supply, and through commercial banks, provided industry and commerce with low interest rate loans. Its vast gold reserves, the largest in the world, exceeded the banknote issue by more than 100%, except for the year 1906. By 1914, it had become one of the most influential lending institutions in Europe. Not unexpectedly, Russia had the smallest national debt in the world. The following table reflects the number of rubles of debt per inhabitant. France, 288. Great Britain, 169.8. Germany, 135.6. Russia, 58.7.
Okay, so far Russia was doing good. So far, so they were doing good so far. But I don't know if Russia was. I don't think Russia was part of the system, but we'll see.
By 1914, 83% of the interest and amortization of the national debt, of which less than 2% was held abroad, was funded by the profits of the Russian state railways. In 1916, the total length of the main lines was 100,817 verst, or kilometers. Russian commercial and canal tonnage of 11,130,000 in 1910 exceeded British merchant tonnage of 10,750,000. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, abolished serfdom, which at that time affected 30% of the population. By 1914, very little land remained in the possession of the Russian estate owners, who were mainly the nobility. 80% of the arable land was in the hands of the peasants, which had been ceded to them for a very small sum. This land was held in trust by the village commune, or mir. However, after the passing of the Stolypin Act in 1906, peasants could obtain individual title with hereditary rights.
Nice.
By 1913, 2 million families had availed themselves of this opportunity to acquire what became known as Stolypin farms. Nearly 19 million acres, 7,689,027 hectares, were allotted to these individual peasant proprietors by the land committees. The Peasant State Bank, which was described at that time as the greatest and most socially beneficent institution of land credit in the world, granted loans at a low rate of interest, which was in effect a handling charge. Between 1901 and 1912, these loans increased from 222 million rubles to 1.168 billion rubles.
Oh, wow.
Agricultural production soared so that by 1913, Russia had become the world's breadbasket, as the following table reveals. Russia provided 42.3% of the world's barley, 30.3% of the world's oats, 67% of the world's rye, and 31.2% of the world's wheat.
Okay.
Russian agricultural production of cereals exceeded the combined production of Argentina, Canada, and the United States by 25%. In 1913, Russia had 37.5 million horses, more than half of all those in the world.
Wow.
She also produced 80% of the world's flax and provided more than 50% of the world's egg imports. Mining and industrial output also expanded by huge margins. Between 1885 and 1913, coal production increased from 259.6 million poods to 2,159.8 million poods. Cast iron production rose from 25 million poods in 1890 to 1,378 million poods in 1913, and petroleum production rose from 491.2 million poods in 1906 to 602.1 million poods in 1916. From 1870 to 1914, industrial output grew by 1% per annum in Great Britain, 2.75% per annum in the United States, and 3.5% per annum in Russia. During the period from 1890 to 1913, industrial production quadrupled, and Russian industries were able to satisfy 80% of internal demand for manufactured goods, a perfect example of autarky. Throughout the last 20 years of peacetime imperial rule, 1895 to 1914, the increase in gross domestic product averaged 10% per annum. With the Russian state bank creating the people's money out of nothing at almost zero interest, as opposed to the rest of the world where central banks allowed parasitic private banks to create their nation's money supply at usurious rates of interest, it comes as no surprise to find that in 1912, Russia had the lowest levels of taxation in the world.
Okay, so right now, Russia is doing its thing. Hey, well, hold on. So far, so good. We're at this point in this show, but we got to give Russia a round of applause. So the Russian state bank creating the people's money out of nothing at almost zero interest, as opposed to the rest of the world where central banks allowed parasitic private banks to create their nation's money supply at usurious rates of interest. So it's no surprise to find out that Russia had the lowest levels of taxation in the world. So Russia's taxes were low because they were taking care of their people. They weren't using the private bankers. They were doing their own stuff. Shout out to them.
These very low rates of taxation also attest to the efficiency of the Russian government. Furthermore, throughout this period of state banking, there was no inflation and no unemployment. Between 1897 and 1913, state receipts rose from 1.4 million gold rubles to 3.471 million gold rubles. By 1914, the surplus on the budget account was 512 million gold rubles, and there was no increase in taxation. Throughout the same period, the foreign trade balance between exports and imports was in surplus. An indication of the financial health of the Russian economy can be gauged from the following comparative table of gold reserves. The gold reserves in banknotes are expressed in millions of rubles. An independent study by British lawyers concluded that the...
One second, let's go back to this right here. So, oh, wow. Look at that. You can see the difference, okay? So central bank, central bank, central bank. So you had all these different central banks of France, Bank of England, and Bank of Rijksbanks or whatever. So check this out. If you pay attention, Russia had more gold than banknotes. Everybody else had more banknotes than gold. That right there, if you got more banknotes than gold, then you're going to have to, you're not going to have to, but you're going to charge crazy usury rates or higher interest to basically make up to go and buy. Oh my goodness. See, this is what happens when you take care of your economy. This is what happens when you take care of your country and your country's economy. This is what happens when private bankers get a hold of it.
Are expressed in millions of rubles. An independent study by British lawyers concluded that the Russian code of laws and judiciary were the most advanced and impartial in the world. Elementary education was obligatory and free, right up to university level, where only nominal fees were charged. Between 1906 and 1914, 10,000 schools were opened annually.
Nice.
Russian universities were renowned for their high academic standards. In labor relations, the Russians were pioneers. Child labor was abolished over 100 years before it was abolished in Great Britain in 1867. Russia was the first industrialized country to pass laws limiting the hours of work in factories and mines. Strikes, which were forbidden in the Soviet Union, were permitted and minimal in Tsarist times. Trade union rights were recognized in 1906, while an inspectorate of labor strictly controlled working conditions in factories. In 1912, social insurance was introduced. Labor laws were so advanced and humane that President William Taft of the United States was moved to say that the Emperor of Russia has passed workers' legislation which was nearer to perfection than that of any democratic country. The people of all races in the Russian Empire had an equality of status and opportunity, which was unparalleled in the modern world. His Imperial Majesty...
They said the modern world. Oh, wow. The modern world. So Russia was not a part of the modern world, which I guess the modern world would be considered being part of the private banking system.
Tsar Nicholas II, 1868 to 1917, and his state bank had created a workers' paradise that was unrivaled in the history of mankind. On the 17th of November, 1917, the Rothschilds, fearful the replication of this extraordinary example of freedom and prosperity would destroy their malevolent banking empire, instigated and financed a Judeo-Bolshevik revolution in Russia, which wrecked and ruined a wonderful country and resulted in the deaths by murder and starvation, according to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of 66 million innocent people.
Oh, no. So that's what that is? Instigated and financed a Judeo-Bolshevik revolution in Russia. But why? What was that over? What was that over? It wrecked and ruined a wonderful country and resulted in, 1917. Oh, Russia, you were doing so good. You were doing fantastic. Dang.
People. The creation and control of the Soviet Union. In Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, author...
Wait a minute. Soviet Union. So Soviet Union versus Russia? Soviet Union was a communist federation republic formed in 1910, while Russia is a country that emerged after the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991. The Soviet Union was a political entity that included Russia and 14 other republics, while Russia is a sovereign state within the world today. Really? Oh man, we're about to learn about Russia. So, okay, so I know the Soviet Union is no more, but the Soviet Union, it was a communist federation of republics formed in 1922. Oh man, okay, we got to keep going.
Professor Anthony Sutton, with the assistance of State Department documents and personal papers of American international bankers, details the enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxist socialism. Without the financial support of J.P. Morgan's Guarantee Trust Company, John D. Rockefeller's Chase National Bank, Jacob Schiff's Kuhn Loeb Company, and Ulf Aschberg of the Swedish Banken, the Judeo-Bolshevik Revolution would not have succeeded.
Okay, I have to pay attention to that again. I didn't get that. So let's see. The creation and control of the Soviet Union. Okay, so we have to pay attention to this. Here we go.
Soviet Union. In Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, author Professor Anthony Sutton, with the assistance of State Department documents and personal papers of American international bankers, details the enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxist socialism. Without the financial support of J.P. Morgan's Guarantee Trust Company, John D. Rockefeller's Chase National Bank, Jacob Schiff's Kuhn Loeb Company, and Ulf Aschberg of the Swedish Banken, the Judeo-Bolshevik Revolution would not have succeeded. Of more particular interest in the financing of the revolution is the role which Maxim Litvinov, 1876 to 1951, who was born Meyer Genoch Moskowitz Wallach Finkelstein, played as a revolutionary in destroying Imperial Russia and handing it over to the international bankers. Litvinov commenced his revolutionary career in 1898. In 1901, he was arrested and spent 18 months in prison, from which he escaped. In 1903, he was entrusted with money, which was used to finance and distribute the newspaper of the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, Iskra, which was printed in London. In 1905, Litvinov received further funds from Friends from Abroad, which enabled the purchase of arms, again in London. Thereafter, Litvinov, now known as Papasha, or Daddy, became the source of all foreign funds and was appointed treasurer of the party, a decision which Lenin could not overrule because Litvinov was a representative of the Rothschilds with powers exceeding those of Lenin. Lenin was merely informed of the decision.
Wow.
A few months later, at a meeting in Geneva, Litvinov was elected Secretary of Foreign Transport Groups. Lenin was again informed of this decision. Litvinov was never a genuine revolutionary, but instead used Bolshevism as a disguise in order to advance the aims of his master's agenda.
Wow.
From 1908 to 1918, Litvinov resided in London with the assistance of his English friends. During this period, he held a variety of occupations working for a publishing house, Williams & Norgate, a tourist agency, and selling farm machinery. Presumably, these occupations provided a suitable cover for his clandestine activities. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, the Russian government demanded that all its citizens be returned to Russia in order to serve in the army. However, the British authorities allowed Litvinov to remain. In 1916, Litvinov married a daughter of one of the most distinguished Jewish families in England, Ivy Lowe. On the 3rd of January 1918, Litvinov was appointed as the authorized representative of Soviet Russia. One of his first tasks was to demand that the money held at the Bank of England on behalf of the Tsarist embassy be handed over to him. The bank duly complied. In September 1918, a conspiracy against the Bolsheviks involving British Ambassador Robert Bruce Lockhart was exposed. Both Lockhart and Litvinov were arrested by their respective governments, and as a result of a subsequent exchange, Litvinov returned to Moscow. His new assignment was to secure fast outflow of gold and jewelry from Russia via Scandinavia under the cover of a scheme to purchase steam engines later known as gold engines. A quarter of Russia's gold reserves were transferred to Sweden for onward transshipment.
Dang, so they are on Russia's ass right now. They are really trying to get at Russia. Man. So Russia held out for a long time. Russia held out for a really long time.
For the Rothschilds, it was now retribution time. On the 21st of April, 1921, Litvinov was appointed Commissioner of the Council of People's Commissars for Currency Transactions and Sales of Gold Abroad. Several hundred millions, rubles, of our gold went through my hands and was sold abroad. I sold the majority of this gold directly or through various intermediaries to large French companies, which remelted this gold either in France or Switzerland, and then this gold went to its final destination in storage at the American Reserve Bank, Rothschild's privately owned bank. Litvinov had become the authorized representative of the bankers, owners of the FRB, the Bank of England, and Soviet Russia. As can be seen, the Bolshevik Revolution was little more than a giant asset stripping exercise by the Rothschilds. In December 1921, then a giant...
Wow. Wow. Read read that. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Wow.
Asset stripping exercise by the Rothschilds. In December 1921, the Kuzbas Autonomous Industrial Colony was established. It handed over control of a vast industrial complex to a group of American and European investors who had assisted in financing it. Thereafter, millions of gold rubles flowed abroad without any customs duties, allegedly as interest for the capital invested by European bankers, despite the fact that the investments were not all that large. In 1924, Joseph Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union, but Litvinov, who feared no one, remained preeminent. His rudeness to Stalin was legendary. In the purge of 1937 to 1938, nearly all of Litvinov's deputies were arrested and then shot. Litvinov pleaded for the life of one of his closest friends, Boris Domonyakov, and informed Stalin that he could vouch for him. Stalin looked Litvinov in his eyes and replied, "Comrade Litvinov, you can only vouch for yourself." From 1930...
Oh, looked them right in the eye and then was like, got him.
To 1939, Litvinov was People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union. In 1939, relations between National Socialist Germany and the Soviet Union started to thaw a little. This was anathema to Litvinov's masters, who had nightmarish memories of the Holy Alliance struck between Austria, Prussia, and Russia in 815, and Bismarck's Drei Kaiserbund, Three Emperors League, concluded between the same three empires.
Okay, so now so it seems like they're nervous about the past, because when these three, Austria, Prussia, and Russia in 1815, they got together, they had an alliance, and they did presumably pretty good, but, you know, I guess I think two of them by this time had already got put under the central banking system, but Russia is still standing strong.
Empires in 1872. Litvinov objected, but by this time, Stalin had had enough of Litvinov's impudent behavior. On the 3rd of May, 1939, a quiet coup d'etat took place, and Stalin dismissed the puppet of the banking underworld from the position of foreign minister. With its own state bank of the USSR, or Gosbank, which was founded on the 16th of November, 1921, the Soviet Union had finally gained its sovereignty and independence from the international bankers.
What?
All Litvinov's deputies and heads of departments were arrested, but he himself was spared, as he was untouchable. Litvinov was allowed to retire to his dacha, but was kept under constant surveillance. In late 1941, Litvinov's services were once again required. With the Germans banging on the gates of Moscow, Stalin's desperate situation necessitated urgent help from the West.
Wait a minute, hold on. So we're in 1941 now, and the dude who should have got skitty pop wasn't. They let him. They let him go. Okay, so with the Germans banging on the gates of Moscow, Stalin desperate situation necessitated urgent help from the West.
On the gates of Moscow, Stalin's desperate situation necessitated urgent help from the West. Litvinov was sent to Washington as Soviet ambassador. The Americans were reluctant to lend money to the Soviet Union, but Litvinov soon sorted everything out, and within a few weeks, a loan of $1 billion was granted.
Wait a minute, how does that work? Okay, so this dude was sent to Washington as Soviet ambassador? I guess I'm lost. The Americans they didn't want to lend money to the Soviet Union, but then he soon sorted everything out within a few weeks. So Lend-Lease program, so supplies U.S. sent to the USSR, trucks, locomotives, okay. But if it's to this dude will take all the funds and give it back to the private bankers, because that's who his allegiance is to. His allegiance is not to the country, it's to the private bankers.
A Lend-Lease agreement was signed, and over the next 4 years, $11 billion worth of supplies and services were provided. Litvinov could call the White House at any time, and the president, Roosevelt, would see him immediately. Both these stooges of the international bankers pumped gold, the one out of Russia, the other from the people of the United States, into the vaults of Rothschild's Federal Reserve Bank.
So this whole thing is to get gold and to get precious metals out of countries and hoard it and hold it and then make it. Oh my goodness.
Litvinov was recalled in 1943 when the war turned in Russia's favor. His successor as foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, provided an apt epitaph. Litvinov was utterly hostile to us. He deserved the highest measure of punishment at the hands of the proletariat. Every punishment. From the 1st to the 22nd of July, 1944, the international bankers organized a conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Its purpose was to establish a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund, which would govern relations amongst independent nations and maintain fixed exchange rates. Soviet representatives attended the conference, but refused to sign, stating that the proposed institutions were branches of Wall Street. This impertinence of Stalin in all probability angered the Rothschilds, but there was little that they could do while Germany remained undefeated.
So he is not clearly. So Stalin ain't stupid. He ain't dumb. He's like, hold on. I already know how this works, and I know if you're branches of Wall Street, which we just learned that Wall Street was a branch of the private bankers. So the impertinence of Stalin angered these people, which we all know what happens when you make them angry. However, this just proves that. Oh, this. Okay. And Stalin, while Germany remained undefeated, but there's little that they could do while Germany remained undefeated. So Stalin was Germany or Stalin was Russia? I'm trying to get that right. So forgive me for my ignorance on that part.
Between the 17th of July and the 2nd of August, 1945, the Potsdam Conference was held in Germany. It determined the new borders of Europe. From this time, the Soviet Union was gradually frozen out and the start of the Cold War commenced. Stalin had no designs on Western Europe. His army was completely exhausted, and he had more than enough tasks on his hands in absorbing Eastern Europe under his hegemony and repairing all the damage to his country, which he had inflicted on himself by provoking Germany into starting a preventative war. From a military perspective, the dropping of alleged nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was unnecessary, as in January 1945, Japan was already trying to secure surrender terms. The firebombing of these two cities served two more sinister purposes. 1. As a punishment to the Japanese for having set up their own state bank, and 2. As a warning to the Soviet Union, which also had a state bank.
Wow. Did you know that? The purpose of Hiroshima. What? That is crazy. The purpose of Hiroshima. Oh my goodness. The purpose of Hiroshima was a message. And we think on the surface it's this, but underneath it, it was over money. The private bankers was like, you want to set up your own stuff? We're going to show you. So, oh my goodness. So from a military perspective, the dropping of alleged Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was unnecessary. In January, Japan was already trying to secure surrender terms. So they were already like, yo, we surrender.
Japan was already trying to secure surrender terms.
But these two cities served two more purposes. It was a punishment for Japanese for setting up their own state bank. And it was a warning to the Soviet Union. So it was a punishment and it was man, that's crazy.
The bombing of these two cities served two more sinister purposes.
Wow.
As a punishment to the Japanese for having set up their own state bank, and 2. As a warning to the Soviet Union, which also had a state bank. The Cold War was prosecuted, initially, by the Western countries in order to bring the Soviet Union to heel. Stalin.
So at this point, we already know that the Western country was already under central banking rule by private bankers. So the military power and might that the U.S. had was being used to basically, show might and force for private bankers. It wasn't to, U.S. is the best country in the world. No, it was all for one. Everything is always for one reason. And it was, oh my goodness. When you learn this, it's not hard to grasp, but once you understand it, what you were told on the surface, underneath, it was always for the same reason. We're trying to enslave you with our currency, and we're going to do it, whether you like it or not, with force or with might or with finances.
Initially by the Western countries in order to bring the Soviet Union to heel. Stalin, who was rather more of a nationalist than a communist, resisted and was allegedly poisoned and then allowed to die from a massive stroke for which he did not receive any medical treatment on the 1st of March, 1953.
Oh, wow.
Thereafter, the Cold War degenerated into a farce as the West, and in particular the United States, invested heavily in the Soviet Union. Huge investments were made at the Gorky plant, which built Ford trucks, and the largest automotive plant in the world at Volgograd, which manufactured Fiat cars. There was also substantial investments in aviation, computers, and electricity. The Soviet Union became an investment destination of choice. The Russians soldiered on, but with 50% of their budget being allocated to armaments, this was a war which they could not win in the long term. This explains why living standards in the Soviet Union could never match those achieved in the West, notwithstanding the provision of free services such as education and housing. In 1991, the Soviet Union imploded and a swarm of advisors arrived from the USA who introduced the wonders of unregulated free market capitalism, which included income tax and usury.
What? They didn't have income tax? They didn't have income tax up until that time. Oh, wow. They weren't under income tax until this happened. So then in 91, when the Soviet Union imploded, the advisors arrived from the US and they introduced wonders of unregulated free market capitalism, which included income tax and oh my gosh.
Introduced the wonders of unregulated free market capitalism, which included income tax and usury. The primary purpose of these advisors was to present the law on the Central Bank of Russia at the right moment, which hardly did less damage than a whole army of invaders in making Russia lose its sovereignty. For almost 200 years, the Tsars and Soviets resisted. But finally, Russia fell entirely into the hands of the Rothschilds.
Oh, man, Russia, you held out for as long as you could. Man. Oh, the Russians called them oh my goodness. So they held out for a really long time. A really long time. They held out the longest. They held it down for as long as they could. So then, is it safe to say the Soviet Union was previously Russia? I'm going to have to study that some more.
Rothschild's responsibility for the Anglo-Boer War. Throughout the 19th century, the world's monetary system was based on the gold standard, which had been developed and maintained by the Rothschilds. The discovery of the largest gold fields in the world on the Witwatersrand in 1886 created a new source of supply, which had to be controlled if this dishonest financial system was to survive. Unfortunately for the Rothschilds, these new mines were located in the independent Zuid-Afrikanische Republiek. Streams of immigrants and speculators soon arrived in the country. Some of them were British, but a larger number consisted of mostly Russian, Polish, and German Jews, with roving propensities and no strongly rooted attachment to an old country. The gold mine owners were almost entirely Jewish. The leading company was the Eckstein Group, named after its managing director, Hermann Eckstein. This combination included Consolidated Goldfields and South Neumann & Co. Professor John Atkinson Hobson writes in The War of South Africa, Its Causes and Effects, that Rothschild had a controlling interest in Goetz & Company, and that Rothschild stands for the Exploration Company, which is in effect Werner, Beit, and Rothschild. Furthermore, he adds that the dynamite monopoly and the rich and powerful liquor trade, licit and illicit, is entirely in the hands of the Jews. The stock exchange is, needless to say, mostly Jewish, and the press of Johannesburg is chiefly their property. By the early 1890s, the foreign workers and speculators had started to outnumber the Boers. In 1896, after the abortive Jameson raid, which tried to overthrow the Transvaal government, the South African League was founded as a Rothschild front in order to agitate for the granting of voting rights to the Uitlanders, or foreigners. In order to protect their status, the Boers would only grant the franchise after a period of 14 years of residence. On the 30th of May, 1899, at a conference held in Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, President Paul Kruger offered to reduce the period of residence to 7 years. The British High Commissioner, Sir Alfred Milner, was unmoved and held to his point of view that it was reform or war. Eventually, Kruger, bowing his head between his big red hands, hot tears streaming down his bearded cheeks, cried out in anguish, "It is my country that you want." In September 1899, in an act of provocation, the British started to mass troops on the southern Transvaal border. A request on the 9th of October 1899 that Her Majesty's government cease the constant bringing up of troops to the borders of the Republic and the sending of reinforcements from all parts of the British Empire was ignored. 2 days later, war broke out. Although the Boers had only a part-time army of mounted horsemen, they enjoyed stunning successes in the initial phase of the war. However, they were ultimately outgunned, outnumbered, and in some instances, poorly led. From June 1900 onwards, the Boers resorted to guerrilla warfare. A tiny force of never more than 6,000 active Boers was able to frustrate and tie down almost 450,000 troops of the world's largest empire.
Whoa.
Peace was signed at Vereeniging on the 31st of May, 1902. The war had been an unmitigated disaster for the Boers. In contravention of the Hague Convention of the 29th of July, 1899, which bound Great Britain to observe its rules of civilized warfare, an unprecedented scorched earth policy was introduced. The Boers' homesteads were razed to the ground, wells were poisoned, Their cattle were slaughtered, and their women were raped.
Dang.
25 towns and their contents and 20 villages, including all their churches, were destroyed. 155,000 women and children were herded into 46 concentration camps and housed in tents, where in some camps during winter, temperatures fell below 0 degrees. 34,000 of them died of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and exposure, of whom 81% were under the age of 16.
Dang.
The British also suffered high losses, with 21,942 being killed, 35% in battle, 65% from disease, and 22,829 being wounded. The bankers had the satisfaction of obtaining full control of the gold and other mineral resources of South Africa, of financing the war in the amount of £222 million, and thereby adding a further £132 million to Britain's national debt. For Nathan, Alfred, and Leopold Rothschild, the Anglo-Boer War was a consummate victory. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia was inspired by King O'Malley, an American, who found out the secrets of fractional reserve banking while working for his uncle's bank in New York in the 1880s. When the bank's first governor, Sir Denison Miller, was asked where he proposed obtaining capital for his bank, he replied, "What capital? I don't need any capital. My capital is the entire wealth and credit of the whole of Australia." With an advance of £10,000 from government, which was quickly repaid, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia was founded on the 15th of July, 1912. Although established as a private bank, it operated as a state bank, with the power to carry on all business generally transacted by banks, including that of a savings bank. Furthermore, the bank was entitled to raise capital through the sale of debentures secured by the national credit. Its profits were equally divided into two funds: a reserve fund to meet any liabilities incurred by the bank, and a redemption fund to redeem debentures or other stock issued by the bank. Thereafter, 50% of its profits were allocated for the liquidation of the national debt. For the next 12 years,
50% of its profits were allocated for the liquidation of the national debt.
50% of its profits were allocated for the liquidation of the national debt. For the next 12 years, notwithstanding the years of World War I, 1914 to 1918, Australia enjoyed one of its greatest eras of prosperity. By providing government loans at a nominal rate of interest, viz. 2/3 of 1% per annum, it enabled the country to embark on a huge infrastructure program. It included provision of $18.72 million Australian dollars for the construction of dams and the Murrumbidgee irrigation system, the Great Transcontinental Railroad, electricity power plants, gasworks, harbors, roads, and tramways. In addition, the fruit, wheat, and wool crops of farmers were financed for an amount of $3 million Australian dollars at nominal rates of interest. It made available $4 million Australian dollars to purchase 15 cargo steamers in order to transport Australia's growing exports, and $8 million Australian dollars were allocated to subsidized housing. World War I cost Australia $700 million Australian dollars, but it was financed by the bank as a non-interest-bearing debt. This phenomenal period of prosperity was terminated in 1924 when a bill, which placed control of the bank in the hands of a directorate consisting of a governor, the secretary to the treasury, and 6 persons actively engaged in agriculture, finance, and industry for different terms of years, was introduced by Stanley Melbourne Bruce, Prime Minister 1924 to 1929, and Dr. Earl Page, his coalition partner. There is a suspicion that Bruce may have been bribed, as what he did was completely against the best interests of the Australian people. During his term of office, the Australian government borrowed £230 million from the City of London, and by 1927, the federal and state debt had reached £1 billion, and the budget was in deficit. On the 10th of October, 1924, the bill was proclaimed as an act. The subsequent effect of this act was to place the bank under the control of a body of men who later deprived it of the right to create the nation's money supply free of debt and interest. In 1927, the bank lost its savings bank subsidiary, and although it was permitted to continue issuing banknotes and thereby earn a modicum of seigniorage, it thereafter became a central bank operating exclusively for the benefit of private banks.
Dang.
The final betrayal of the bank occurred on the 20th of March, 1947, when the House of Representatives voted by 55 to 5 votes for it to become a member of the International Monetary Fund, and thus subject to the decrees and dictates of the Rothschild-controlled Bank for International Settlements. World War I. World War I started on the 28th of June, 1914, when Gavrilo Princip, allegedly of Jewish origin and a member of a terrorist group, the Black Hand, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, and his Czech-born wife at Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Both of them.
Princip was a collaborator of Leon Trotsky, real name Lev Davidovich Bronstein, a Russian Jew who was conspiring with a fellow Jew, Vladimir Lenin, named Ulyanov when adopted, real name Zetterbaum, to overthrow the Russian monarchy. He was in turn financed by an American Jew, Jacob Schiff, who was a frontman for an English Jew, Lord Nathan Rothschild, who was one of the masterminds behind this appalling catastrophe.
Wait a minute. He was turned financed by an American, Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff? Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff. So then, if that's Jacob Schiff, then who is... I'm not going to say. I'll just do that on my own.
These facts were confirmed in the United States Senate in 1921 when it was recorded that full responsibility for the First World War lies on the shoulders of the international Jewish bankers. They are responsible for millions of dead and dying. In late October 1926, further confirmation of these incontrovertible facts was revealed in a conversation between British parliamentarian Victor H. Cazalet and Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947. When the former asked who the international Jewish financiers were, Ford replied, "I have several books which will tell you who they all are. They were responsible for the last war and will in the future always be capable of creating a war when they feel their pockets need one." Trade rivalry, competing alliances, and misunderstood mobilizations are often proffered as being the primary causes of World War I. However, the real reasons in order of importance are as follows. 1. To destroy the Russian Empire and its state bank. 2. To break up the other empires, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman, into smaller states, which could then be exploited more efficiently through the establishment of central banks. 3. The theft of Palestine and the creation of a Zionist puppet state under the direct control of the Rothschilds. By the end of 1916, the British and French armies were in danger of losing the war, with the latter army having already mutinied on the Western Front. The British had lost their naval supremacy at the Battle of Jutland on the 3rd of May, 1916, when the German Navy, outnumbered by 2 to 1, humiliated the invincible Royal Navy, sinking 12 vessels for the loss of 6, and losing 2,551 sailors compared to the British loss of 6,094.
Oh, wow.
Both Kaisers were desperate to bring an end to this fratricidal and pointless slaughter. Seemingly out of the blue came an offer from Lord Rothschild to secure American intervention in return for handing over Palestine to a group of Jewish Zionists after the liquidation of the Ottoman Empire. On the 6th of April, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and the other Central Powers, and on the 2nd of November, 1917, Lord Rothschild and his Zionist collaborators received their written understanding by Great Britain to eventually hand over Palestine to Jewish settlers.
What?
This infamous document,
That was
to eventually
1917?
hand over Palestine to Jewish settlers. This infamous document, known as the Balfour Declaration, was drafted by Lord Arthur James Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, and General Jan Christian Smuts, a member of the Imperial War Cabinet. The misery of this unnecessary war dragged on for another 2 years. Russia was totally destroyed, and an insoluble problem was created in the Middle East. As Rabbi Reichhorn prophetically remarked in 1859, "Wars are the Jews' harvest, for with them we wipe out the Christians and get control of their gold. We have already killed 100 million of them. We shall drive the Christians into war by exploiting their national vanity and stupidity. They will then massacre each other, thus giving room for our own people."
Man.
In similar vein, Gutli Schnapper, Mayor Amschel Rothschild's wife, is reputed to have said shortly before she died in 1849, "If my sons did not want war, there would have been none." An armistice was declared on the 11th of November, 1918, and 7 months later, on the 28th of June, 1919, the deeply flawed Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany had to accept exclusive blame and pay extortionate reparations of £6.6 billion, equivalent to the entire wealth of the country, even though the other principal belligerents, England, France, and Russia, were equally, if not more, blameworthy. This indemnity would be used to repay the international bankers the fraudulent loans and interest, which had been previously lent to the governments of Great Britain and France. As General Smuts said at the conference, "Everything we have done here is far worse than the Congress of Vienna. The statesmen of 1815 at least knew what was going on. Our statesmen have no idea."
My goodness. Yo, the more you learn, the more you know, you will simply understand that everything has the same underlining issue. Every single one of these situations they're all fighting over this. Every war, everything that we have now we see is fought over the same reason. Private banking, every single thing. And people who we thought were bad, turns out that they were fighting against the private bankers. So which then you have the victor gets to tell the story. The dead guy can't say anything. So you believe the story of the victor. But when you dig deep and start to realize things, you start to notice that who you thought was the bad person in all reality was just simply trying to fight for stopping the enslavement of their country and then inevitably the entire world. Well, I'm not going to be able to make it to the AI portion of the show today, but we are going to wrap it up with today's show. On that note right there, we'll go to part 5 tomorrow, and we'll be able to do an entire show tomorrow. I just had to get through this one, and turns out this one was a really good one to get a good understanding. So we'll be back tomorrow to continue the Daily Fitness live stream show and to pick up where we left off and to continue on with the rest of these. We don't have much more left of this of this segment, but we're going to go ahead and power through it. So thank y'all for tuning in, man. Hopefully y'all enjoyed that. Hopefully you learned something and brought some value and knowledge to you. With that being said, we'll see y'all later. Take care. Peace.
Baby, I'm out some meat. Pockets chunky like cottage cheese. Real nigga, I just gotta be. Smoking weed that don't gotta see. Used to be a hustler prodigy. I love when people say they proud of me. I'm eating good, smoking broccoli. Taking over blocks like Monopoly. Only fuck the ones that's my policy. Most of these hoes trying to cause a scene. Like niggas mad they not on the team. See, I got bread, then bought a dream. The game on like and I got the keys like Jay. My fame won't stop, but the only thing I'm chasing. The game on like and I got the keys like Jay. I plug your bitch like a 6-string. Jordan with the bitches got 6 rings. Smoke till my bitch a split screen. The press with pain pills and sipping lane. Riding dirty, but I'm extra clean. Lyrics nice, but I'm extra mean. All-star heavyweight like Wolverine. The bitch nice like she open me. I flip money like Clover G. Gang hustle like TIP. Hard baby like DIG. Acronym like KRT. The game on lock and I got the keys like Jay-Z. My fame won't stop, but the only thing I'm chasing. The game on lock and I got the keys like Jay-Z. Where your artery, cutting up, who sharp with me, rolling up accordingly, pulling hoes, no sorcery, rapping like y'all forcing me. If I ever write it, then it's forgery. Nigga selling to the rock like a Florida beat. Lyrical monster on the Lord of Beats. Text nigga, my bitch Georgia Peach. Pimp tight nigga, I do more than cheat. Cold like D-Wade, I